Our next keynote speaker is coming up next. Let's welcome back Sophia Flucker from MiCiM Limited, who's talking data centres, the road to net zero. Welcome back, Sophia.
Hi, thanks.
Thank you. And well, as they say, the virtual floor is all yours.
Okay, great. Thanks everyone for joining the presentation. So my presentation is going to look at data center sustainability and specifically what we're doing to travel towards net zero. So by way of a brief introduction, I'm a chartered mechanical engineer. So my background in data centers is really focused on the cooling side of things. But just so you know a bit more about OI and MiCiM. So we provide services throughout the project cycle. When we started OI, we were very focused on the operational phase of things. So looking at energy assessments, looking at how to make data centers more efficient. And we've expanded our approach to that, which was very much collaborative and involving consultancy and training. We realized that we could have a lot of influence on those energy efficient outcomes if we got involved earlier in the project. So we help clients writing design briefs, we help them doing high level designs, design peer reviews. And we also spend a lot of time commissioning on site. So I'm the managing director at OI. Last year we merged with MiCiM. He specialised in construction management and project management for mission critical facilities. So you can see how their services complement ours on the diagram. So I'll move on and get straight into the content. So I think I should probably start by making sure we all have a common understanding of what is net zero carbon. So essentially we're looking to have a balance of carbon emitted versus carbon removed. So the way that we do that is first by committing to science-based targets. And typically we're looking at limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. We need to reduce our emissions to zero or near zero, and then offsetting the remainder. So another term which is used almost synonymously, but it actually has a slightly different definition, is carbon neutrality. So in that case, you can become carbon neutral straight away because you can become carbon neutral just by offsetting. There's actually no requirement to reduce your emissions first. So net zero is perhaps harder, but I think it's really addressing the root cause of the problem. So it's not saying we can keep doing what we're doing, keep polluting, and then just pay for it by offsetting. We need to really address the source of our emissions. So just looking at kind of the global issue and why do we want to do this? So we know that global warming is happening. We know that emissions have been increasing. And this 1.5 degree temperature increase, this is comparing 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. This has been identified as a threshold below which we can avoid the worst impacts of climate change. That's not to say that there aren't any impacts, and we're seeing them already. But this is the internationally agreed level where we're trying to limit how many emissions that we're emitting in order that we are not exceeding this level. So many countries have signed up to these commitments. In the UK, the commitment is to reach net zero by 2050. And we are on the way to 1.5 degrees. At the moment, we're already at 1.1 degrees, and emissions are still increasing. So we do need some drastic action if we're to follow this path. So there's already work in place to try and reduce emissions. There's lots of policy, there's legislation and those kind of things. Unfortunately, it's not working. So at the moment, the actual projection for greenhouse gas emissions is predicted to increase by 10% by 2030, comparing that to 2010, based on what we already have in place. But really, we need a much bigger reduction if we're going to meet this 1.5 degrees. So what we're doing right now is not enough. We really need some drastic change if we're going to be in line with what our targets are. So apart from the global impacts to life on Earth and all of us and our ecosystems, our environment, as I mentioned, policy and regulation are already in place to try and force behaviour. So this diagram shows you a selection of the different treaties, the different agreements, the different strategies which are out there at a national and international level to try and change behaviours. There's plenty more on here, but as you can see, it's not something that started recently. I think it's fair to say we're probably going to see more regulation, more policies pushing things in the same direction. There's probably a couple which are on here which maybe noteworthy with respect to data centers. So the Energy Efficiency Directive, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive from the EU. There's looking at that applied to data centers. There's the EU taxonomy, where there's an assessment framework for data centers. So that's quite an interesting one, because it's looking at using something which originally started as a voluntary initiative. So that's the European Code of Conduct for Data Center Energy Efficiency, which is something which has been with us for 15 years and is looking at actually turning that into policy and into regulation. So essentially, the content of it is not going to change too much, because it's agreed that that's a useful list of best practices. But it's something which will now become more than just voluntary. So maybe an interesting point to reflect on is, as well as all of these policy drivers, there's been quite a lot of movement on a voluntary level for the industry and for organisations to sign up to ways to reduce their emissions and to act. And I think part of that has been in order to show leadership and to make a difference, and perhaps to avoid some of these legislative actions coming into place. But I think eventually legislation does catch up. So I think it's important that the voluntary initiatives are there. But eventually you have to act, because legislation is going to force you to. I think you don't want to be in a position where the legislation is, or the policy may be well-meaning, but it has perhaps unintended consequences. So this is why the industry has sort of tried to get ahead of things and work out a voluntary arrangement, which can be effective, but which can perhaps mean that we get better policies when they do come along. So just to touch on sustainability reporting, which is not necessarily data center specific, but applies to all large organizations. So sustainability reporting is full of acronyms. So there's a few on here. I'm probably going to throw in a few more as I describe it. So quite a lot of these are aligned to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, so the SDGs. GRI seems to be a very widely adopted set of best practices around reporting. And the idea is really to get away from greenwash, because I think it's very easy for organisations to use their environmental credentials, their sustainability as a marketing tool. So to say, oh, we've offset all of our carbon, or we've achieved this and we've achieved that. But there's quite often a lack of transparency and what's their actual performance. So the GRI sets out a reporting framework, and it really details specifically which areas do you need to report and how you're going to measure them, because it means that it's much easier to compare what's out there, and I think it gives a common baseline for reporting. So as well as these requirements on a legislative level, there is a business imperative which goes beyond that. So there's a kind of few key areas where business can benefit from becoming more sustainable, shown on the slide. Perhaps legislation fits on the bottom left, so resilience against risks. So being prepared for upcoming legislation. Things like brand reputation, I think that's been a driver for some time. So this idea that data centers don't want to be named and shamed as being polluters, I think that we have already seen somewhat of perhaps a backlash against data centers. There have been protests about new data centers being built in certain locations. They are seen as being polluting, perhaps using lots of water and those kind of things. So I think the public image of data centers is something which does motivate people to want to take action. Investor confidence, I think there's increasing focus on green investments, and it is something that investors are looking for. The industry as a whole is innovative. It's technology-led. It doesn't stay still. So certainly there's business opportunities when it comes to doing things in a more sustainable way. If you can do something differently, that can give you a competitive edge. So that's one way to stand out from your competitors. And I think, of course, on a kind of basic day-to-day level, there can be bottom line savings. So if we're saving energy, we're saving money. That's a very clear business case, particularly with the way that energy prices are going. If we can simplify designs, we can perhaps design out materials. We can get some CapEx savings. Maybe we can reduce our maintenance. that might make even our operation more reliable. So there's lots of benefits to building sustainability into your corporate strategy, not only the more obvious ones. I think some of these are a bit more intangible, so it can be difficult to make the business case for them, but I think businesses are becoming more aware that this is no longer an optional thing. It's no longer an added selling point. It's something that they're being forced to do. And something I'll touch on a bit later is where supply chains are asking for it. So as some of the bigger organizations are really putting this at the heart of their business, and they're really leading through example, they want to be transparent about their performance, they're asking their supply chains to do the same. So it becomes something that we all have to act on. So to give a bit of a feel for where do data centers fit into climate change and emissions. So we're looking at approximately 1% of global electricity demand in 2021. It can be hard to get accurate figures, but these kind of tally up with various studies which have been looked at. So I suppose maybe the absolute figure on its own isn't the most interesting thing here. The point is that this amount of the demand seems to be growing. So it might be 1% now, but what's that going to be in the future? And that's because as a society, as businesses, we're increasingly reliant on information systems. So our use of data centers, all of the technology behind that is growing. I guess in recent years, things like AI, driverless cars, all of these kind of things, it keeps on growing. So although we can make improvements in efficiency, we can cool things more efficiently, we can have more efficient hardware so that we can do more computation using less energy, that's not outpacing the demand. So we can do more with less, but we're still growing because we're just using more data. So anyone who's looked at emissions reporting in general will already be aware of these definitions of the three different scopes of emissions. So scope 1 being direct combustion of fuels. There's a couple of exceptions to that, so refrigeration, leaks, and those kind of things. But essentially, this is direct emissions of fossil fuels, let's say. Scope 2, essentially electricity use. There's a few other things, so if you're using district cooling, district heating, those kind of things, but really the main one is direct electricity use in your business. And scope 3 is everything else. So it's where you've, perhaps you could say, outsourced your emissions. So where you've bought services from elsewhere, you're not directly using the fuel or the electricity, but in purchasing that service, so it's someone else's scope 1 or scope 2 emission. And generally speaking, most of a business's emissions would tend to be in scope 3. So it's interesting, we're talking about what can we do to reduce our emissions, and we have direct control over our scope 1 and our scope 2. But when it comes to scope 3, that's kind of the hidden part of the iceberg, if you like, because it's such a large part of it. And we've got less direct influence over it. So we can use our purchasing power as consumers. This is where we need to try and influence the value chain, make sustainable procurement decisions. But it's interesting that a lot of the focus on energy efficiency tends to be about using less electricity or using energy more efficiently. That's great, but we're not generally, we haven't up to now really been looking at our scope 3, which is a really big part of the picture. So this slide summarizes a study that one of my colleagues, Beth Whitehead, undertook. And her area is life cycle assessment of data centers. So life cycle assessment aiming to look at the total environmental impact of data centers. So not just the energy usage during operation, but going beyond that. So you see on the left-hand side, we can think of the split between, firstly, the IT side of things, so the IT hardware and its energy use, but then also the facility itself, so the power and cooling systems, mechanical and electrical systems. So perhaps the side of things we tend to think about is the total energy use. It's something which is quite visible, it's measured. We know how many kilowatt hours we're using, how many kilowatts, what's our PUE, all of those kinds of things. And there have been improvements in recent years because it's been given a lot of focus. But we tend to not look so much at the equipment impact. So this is the embodied impact of all of that physical hardware. So if you think about servers, they might typically be refreshed every 3 years. So IT hardware, like other electronics, has got a really high environmental impact, although the mass of it might be relatively small. PCBs, printed circuit boards, electronics in general is very polluting to produce and dispose of, because we're using many precious metals which are mined. The recovery routes for those devices are not well understood. Quite often they're shipped to developing countries and processed in unregulated ways. So there's quite a problem looking at IT and e-waste in general and the production of IT. The same is true if we look at the facilities side of things. So in studies which have been done, we tend to think of, well, what's the embodied impact of the building? So the fabric, the concrete, perhaps the steel infrastructure. That tends to be more significant in other building types. So if you think about what's different about data centers, the M&E installation is a lot more, because we're talking about much higher load densities. So we have a lot of electrical equipment. We've got transformers, generators, we've got kilometers of copper cable, those kind of things. If we have a chilled water system, we have lots of pipe work, all of the materials associated with that, all of the batteries, those kind of things. That in itself is quite a large mass of materials, many of which have quite a higher environmental impact. So studies have shown that the IT tends to be the highest embodied impact. The facilities side of things is fairly high also, and perhaps the building itself relatively low compared to the others, so they're not insignificant. Another important side of things is the actual energy mix, which I think this is something which is quite well understood as well. So are you purchasing fossil fuel energy or renewables? And renewables tend to be purchased rather than generated on site. This is something which a lot of hyperscalers have signed up to. I guess it can be a relatively easy way to be shown to be taking environmental stewardship. And that also makes quite a big difference when we're looking at the total environmental impact. So all of these have an impact on cost, OPEX, CAPEX, and the brand reputation. So in terms of what do we need to do, this is kind of giving a summary of what does the process look like. So I think firstly, we need to measure our emissions. So we need to measure where our impacts are and benchmark them. There's lots of different tools and standards available to help people do that. The next part is to sign up to commitments. And I think on the next slide, there's a few different examples given. There's various targets and various commitments which organizations have signed up to. So that's one way to say, okay, I'm serious about getting towards net zero. We're going to be transparent about if we reached a certain level by a certain time. And then, of course, I suppose what is the hard bit, which is doing the reduction. So actually taking action, perhaps making use of the GRI standards and other best practices, other tools which are out there to make the reduction. Once you've made that public commitment, of course, you need to report that and make the disclosures. So I think this definitely transparency is part of what we need to do to help people move in the right direction. So some people may already be aware of some of these commitments. So net zero carbon buildings, SBTI, ambition for 1.5 degrees, UN race to zero as well. So some of these are more just general corporate targets. There might be some which focus specifically on buildings. And you can see that the target levels might be slightly different. So some of them are actually more ambitious than the statistic I showed earlier. But very much similar objectives. Essentially, you need to take the same steps. So taking measurements, making commitments, and reporting. I won't spend too long on this slide. I'm just keeping an eye on time. But just thinking about when we talk about science-based targets, what do we really mean? So I think the first step has got to be that we need to stop increasing our emissions, because that's what's happening at the moment. So we need to firstly stop the growth. then make the reductions, and then once we can get down as close as we can to zero, that's when we're looking at the offsetting side of things. In terms of action plans, a summary here of what does that look like. I would say it's got to be something that's really integrated into the corporate strategy. It can't be an add-on. It is quite a commitment if you're going to go public with this reporting and to really make a difference. So taking responsibility for your own emissions, your scope 1 and scope 2, looking at the value chain, so trying to address your scope 3. And that's where I think if everyone is doing this, then everyone is making a reduction. If we're all pulling in the right direction, we can see a bigger impact globally. I touched on embodied carbon earlier. So again, it's this idea that it's not something that we can think about as an add-on. We really need to build it into our processes. So, and the earlier we start in a project to do it, the better, the more influence we can have. So some of the steps might be thinking about, well, can we prevent emissions in the first place? What's the need? Can we avoid over designing things? Can we refurbish rather than build from new? Then it's looking at reductions and optimizations, building in flexibility and those kind of things, so that we're not just looking at the immediate use, but what might happen to our facility at a later point. And thinking about end of life as well, thinking about disassembly, deconstruction. And if we can take all of those steps and minimize our impact, then that residual part we can offset. Similar idea here. So thinking about circularity throughout construction projects, it's something that you need to really engage with all of the stakeholders for. It's got to be something built into the process, built into contracts even. So we really need to be starting early on and identifying the opportunities, making it clear what people are responsible for, and following up on that. And again, without going into too much detail, the next set of slides gives some really specific ideas about, well, how can we build data centers in a more sustainable way? So thinking at the design stage, reducing complexity, looking at more simplified structures. On the cooling side of things, looking at our design conditions, how cold does it really need to be? Low energy cooling, perhaps zero refrigeration or compressor-free cooling. Looking at our power sources, so renewables, whether that's off-site or on-site. And on the ICT side of things, perhaps looking at refurbished equipment. So I know there was an interesting study done recently, Interact, which is something launched from TechBuyer, and they were showing that refurbished equipment can outperform new servers, which I thought was really interesting. I think it's not something that is really mainstream, using refurbished equipment, but I think we can't keep on buying new servers and disposing of them in the way that we're doing at the moment. Again, I've touched on procurement already, so this is looking at what can you do to influence the supply chain. As far as data centers go, there's a project, Green Public Procurement, which is a European Commission project, which talks about some tools and a methodology where you can kind of pick up a pre-designed list, if you like, to help you procure in a more sustainable way, specifically for data centers. If we're looking at construction, I think waste on site is a big thing to think about. Perhaps looking at site vehicles as well. Can more of those get away from fossil fuel power? On the operation side, there's lots of things here kind of relating to optimization and energy efficiency. I think the last point on there is about training, and I think that's a big part of it, because the main reason operations teams are there is to keep the lights on. So reliability is always going to be their main priority. But in terms of energy efficiency, I guess that's always going to come second. So if you're really serious about saving energy, you've got to resource it. So the information on these slides is perhaps a more graphical way of representing some of the things I just touched on, but just divided this time into the scopes. So looking at where can we reduce our fossil fuels and refrigerants, looking at where there is an opportunity to reduce electricity consumption and how green is that electricity. And scope 3 is kind of everything else, where it can be quite specific to the business type. it's an exercise we've looked at within MiCiM. So we're looking at, well, what can we do as a business to make sure that we're influencing the supply chain and take action on this important part of our emissions. And just to finish up, I really talked about trying to get to net zero, but I think that there's a bigger question, which is looking at circularity of design. So this is kind of getting away from thinking of waste in the same way. So looking at more of closed loop for materials, having a mindset where we are looking to refurbish, reuse. We've got flexibility and modularity built in. We're thinking about the future, design for disassembly. Serve, as I mentioned, because it's just such an important part of it. So there's a study, again, my colleague Beth was involved in it, SEDASI, which is looking at a circular economy for servers. So how can we prevent things from being disposed of and sent off to an unknown country where we know they're not going to be disposed of properly. Just one more statistic on construction. So I think at the moment only 20 to 30% of construction and demolition waste is recovered or recycled. So clearly we've got a long way to go. I think we need to start looking at waste as a resource. So I don't know if we have a little bit of time for questions. Just on the last slide, I just wanted to mention, if you don't get time to have your question answered, or would you like to reach out to me, there's my email address. We have published some papers on sustainability, which are available on the website. And there's a book that I've co-authored, which is coming out later this year. And we do have a chapter on sustainability in that too. Thanks, everyone.
Sophia, thank you very much indeed. We do have a little bit of time just to get a couple of quick questions in, if I may. The first one I'd like to go through is, it was something you touched on really, really early on about whether data centres run fairly targeted when it comes to their emissions. Do you think more regulations needed to improve that kind of performance?
Yes, I don't think the voluntary initiatives are enough by themselves. I think in a way, the industry is never going to make it hard enough for themselves, if you like. I think that they're always going to be tempted to go for the easier option. So although I think it's important that people are, driven by themselves and driven by innovation and wanting to make the reductions, I think it's got to be followed up by regulation. Because if you just, in any industry, I think if you just leave people to self-regulate, you might get to where you want to get to eventually, but there's a real urgency for what we need to achieve.
Talking about balance next, because there are plenty of strategies out there to try and implement and achieve net zero, but at the same time, everyone's also trying to manage level of performance and uptime requirements. Is it either or? Can you balance the two? What advice would you have for people on that?
Sure, yeah, I think there's a bit of a perception that you can't really be reliable and energy efficient at the same time. And that's not actually always the case. I mean, certainly when we're giving people advice on improving their energy performance, that's never at the price of reliability, because it's a given that you're not going to reduce performance. So it's looking at within that opportunity, what can be done. So I think it's, maybe there's some things which, okay, technically that would save energy, but it's just not open to us because it's going to have a negative impact on performance. There's always plenty of things that you can do which can even enhance reliability.
Okay. Sophia Flucker at MiCiM, thank you so much for your time again here at Data Centre Live London. It's been fascinating. Thanks ever so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.